Hello dear students, this is Vishwas. In this video, we will look at the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. If we are reading African American literature, we must have a clear idea about African American history. I also suggest you watch the video on Amiri Baraka and the Black Arts Movement. What was the Civil Rights Movement? The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle by the African Americans in the years of 1950s and 1960s to gain equality under the law of the United States. Racism in America has a long history, beginning with the arrival in 1619 of the first recorded slaves from Africa to British North America in what is now Old Point Comfort near the Jamestown colony. The Jamestown settlement in the colony of Virginia was the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. History acknowledges that these Africans held a status closer to indentured servants. What do you mean by indentured servants? They were unfree laborers who were bound by a signed or forced contract, indenture, to work without pay for the honor of the indenture for a period of time. Yet, in fewer than 50 years, the words African and slave became interchangeable. Therefore, racial crimes by the whites against the blacks have a 300-year-old history. The American Civil War was a civil war from 1861 to 1865, fought between northern states loyal to the Union and the southern states that had separated from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began primarily as a result of the long-standing controversy over the enslavement of black people. It was the economics of slavery and political control of that system that was central to the conflict. Southern states had plenty of black slaves working in their plantations. With free labor available, they wanted to expand their business into other territories towards the northern and western parts of the country. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, wanted to abolish slavery, and war broke out in April 1861 when separatist forces attacked the Union territory, just over a month after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated as the president. The war effectively ended on April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Confederacy collapsed, slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment in the US Constitution, and 4 million enslaved black people were freed. The war-torn nation then entered the Reconstruction era in a partially successful attempt to rebuild the country and grant civil rights to freed slaves. Problem solved? No. The whites found other ways to immobilize the blacks by introducing the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern parts of the United States. These laws were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to keep a check on the blacks from getting political and economic power during the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1877. It was all about getting power in the southern states of the US. So they legalized segregation. The US Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine for facilities for African Americans. Whites and the blacks were to use separate establishments and institutions. The legal principle of separate but equal racial segregation was extended to public facilities and transportation, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to the facilities for white Americans. Sometimes there were no facilities for the black community. As a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South. This is one of the major reasons why many blacks moved to the North, especially Harlem, where you had the Harlem Renaissance. So things were slightly better in Harlem. You might be wondering, who is this Jim Crow? Was he some judge or some particular person? No. Jim Crow persona is a theater character created by Thomas D. Rice and a racist depiction of African Americans and their culture. The character was based on a folk trickster named Jim Crow that had been long popular among black slaves. By 1838, the term Jim Crow was used as an offensive term towards black people through to the end of the 19th century before it became associated with Jim Crow laws. So these laws were not really named after Jim Crow, but then people began to associate these laws since these laws were meant to subjugate, oppress black people. This Jim Crow character's name came to be connected with this set of laws. As a result of Rice's fame, Jim Crow by 1838 had become a pejorative expression meaning Negro. When Southern legislatures passed laws of racial segregation directed against black people at the end of the 19th century, these laws became known as Jim Crow laws. Years after the abolition of slavery in 1865, the scars left on the minds of the whites and the blacks never fully healed. Hence, the blacks had to fight a long battle to get their basic human rights, even in the 20th century, until the Jim Crow laws were finally removed from the legal system. Racism was deeply entrenched in all the public spheres of life, even in the functioning of schools. These blacks were looking for legal remedies, and legal solutions take time. In 1954, segregation of public schools, which was state sponsored, was declared unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education. The problem we all live with is a 1964 painting by Norman Rockwell. It is considered an iconic image in the civil rights movement. Some of us might be reminded of Ayyangali taking Panchami to school. This painting depicts Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African American girl, on her way to William Frantz Elementary School on an all-white public school on November 14, 1960, during the New Orleans school desegregation crisis. Because of threats and violence against her, she is escorted by 4 deputy US Marshals. On the wall behind her is written the racial slur nigger and the letters KKK. A smashed and splattered tomato thrown against the wall is also visible. The white protesters are not visible as the viewer is looking at the scene from their point of view. We will hear the term KKK quite often when reading African American literature. The Ku Klux Klan, commonly called the KKK or simply the Klan, is an American white supremacist hate group whose primary targets are African Americans as well as Jews, immigrants, leftists and homosexuals. The Klan has existed in three distinct eras at different points in time during the history of the United States. Each has advocated extremist reactionary position such as white nationalism, anti-immigration, especially in later iterations, Nordicism, people of Northern European descent, anti-Semitism, prohibition, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-atheism and anti-Catholicism. Historically, the first Klan used terrorism, both physical assault and murder, against politically active blacks and their allies in the South in the late 1860s until it was suppressed around 1872. All three movements have called for the purification of American society and all are considered right-wing extremist organizations. The civil rights movement, championed by the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the cultural icons, helped to an extent to improve black lives. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 empowered the blacks. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits laws that discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religious belief or national origins. Hence, the US, this powerful nation, has only legally acknowledged African Americans as full citizens for about 50 years. The year 2019 was very unique in Academy Awards, Oscars, with respect to African American identity. The Best Picture, Best Original Screenplay and Best Supporting Actor was won by the crew of the film Green Book, which is an American biographical comedy drama road film set in 1962. The film was inspired by the true story of a tour of the Deep South by African American classical jazz pianist Don Shirley and Italian American bouncer Frank Tony Lip Vallalonga, who served as Shirley's driver and bodyguard. The film is named after the Negro motorist Green Book, a mid-20th century guidebook for African American travelers written by Victor Hugo Green. The Negro Travelers Green Book, or simply the Green Book, was an annual guidebook for African American road trippers, published by Victor Hugo from 1936 to 1966 during the era of Jim Crow laws. The book gave valuable information about safe, black-friendly lodgings and restaurants. The best adapted screenplay was won by the movie BlackKlansman, KKK Klansman. The plot follows the first African American detective in the city's police department as he sets out to infiltrate and expose the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. Then comes another movie, The actress Regina King won the Academy Award for the Best Supporting Actress in 2019 for the film If Beale Street Could Talk. Set in New York, it told the story of the 22-year-old Fonnie and 19-year-old Tish. They have known each other since their childhood. Their relationship transforms into love and they become engaged. It is the early 1970s and they struggle to find a place to live as most New York City landlords refuse to rent apartments to black people. They eventually find a place in a warehouse. Tish becomes pregnant. One day, Fonnie is falsely accused of raping a white woman. Even though it was physically impossible for Fonnie to reach the scene of the crime from the place where he was at the time, which is the apartment, Fonnie is arrested and jailed before trial. A policeman who wanted to extract revenge from Fonnie falsely testifies that he saw him fleeing the scene. The victim, who has not seen the perpetrator, is manipulated by the policeman to falsely identify Fonnie from a lineup. Tish's statement that Fonnie was with her is not accepted by the court as she is his fiancée. The cooked up evidence is stacked up against Fonnie and Tish has to fight the criminal justice system, which is not just towards the blacks. The title is a reference to Tish's desperate attempts to clear Fonnie's name. The racial hatred of the people in power has struck down all hope of getting her child's father out of prison. The title is a reference to the 1916 W.C. Handy blues song Beale Street Blues, named after Beale Street in downtown Memphis, Tennessee. It's in a different state. Though the novel is set in New York, Beale Street in Memphis was a hub of African American expression, music, and freedom. The author depicts how the black voice was muted by systematic oppression. The reader can only wonder if only Beale Street could talk and prove Fonnie's innocence. The novel or the film thus explored the theme of love in black lives and exposed black oppression at the hands of the legal system, which kept its eyes shut to racial crimes. 50 years from the publication of If Beale Street Could Talk, the blacks are still speechless as hate crimes are being regularly reported in this so-called powerful nation, even in the 21st century. For the past few months, America has been burning up in protest against the murder of George Floyd by the white policeman. The efficacy of the legal system should be rethought when little children to the old have to be on the road shouting Black Lives Matter. History is repeating itself because we have not learned from it. In the next video, we will go back 70 years and meet the author If Beale Street Could Talk, and the novel we have in our syllabus, Go Tell It on the Mountain. James Baldwin, who along with Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison broke new ground in the novel genre and dominated the literary scene, exploring black identity after the Harlem Renaissance. Baldwin in particular became the literary voice of civil rights. In fact, he was a champion of the marginalized, questioning society's hypocritical moral codes, and institutional power in the second half of the 20th century.